Ann Hawthorne presents An Authoress and a Viscount, a Regency Romance, by Ann Hawthorne, performed by Mary Jane Wells. Chapter 1. Lavinia wasn't sure what exactly she expected from this year, the third year of her service at court. Part of her hoped the rules would relax and a lively quadrille would be allowed into the mix of dances. But it was as foolish a hope as wishing the sun would rise in the west one day. As far as Her Majesty was concerned, all this skipping around and twirling was most improper, and certainly would not do at a ball in her honour. Lavinia had never been to a proper ball before she came to court, as the second keeper of the robes. Not even at the height of her literary fame, when she was feted by the late Dr. Johnson's own friends, did she receive such invitations. However, she was far from ignorant of the output of printers. Her publisher, Mr. Wickman of St. Paul's Churchyard, made a good trade of music sheets for quadrilles, and for the more staid dancers, allemands. But that was outside, in the bustling world of London and Bath and Bristol, and the cities beyond, in the world where life was churning like a wild sea. Here, at King George's court, it was more akin to a mirror-smooth lake, and the dance seen most frequently at his Queen's birthday balls was the cotillon. This year, like all others, Queen Charlotte's birthday ball was held before her birthday. Her birthday was in May. However, according to the labyrinthine logic of court ceremonies, her birthday was celebrated in January. Lavinia drank her third glass of unsweetened champagne this evening. She was not usually partial to the drink, to any alcoholic drink, but it was hard to keep herself lively or even lifelike otherwise. She couldn't imagine where the tales of court leisure and indolence came from. Perhaps this sort of life really was going on somewhere far away beyond the orbit of her own experience. Lavinia, however, had to get up at 6 in the morning today, just as she had to do yesterday and every morning for the 3 years before that, and patiently wait to be summoned to her duties. But, of course, she couldn't even show a hint of that kind of regimen at Queen Charlotte's birthday ball. She knew that these were her duties, too, to smile and pretend gentle joy. Not just to pretend, she reminded herself. To be properly good and grateful, she had to do her best to feel it in her heart. How unnatural was she that an appointment most women in the country would have committed murder for brought her nothing but dull misery. "This is going to be your last champagne float for the evening," Mrs. Juliana Schwellenberg said, her tone that of a guardian to a child, as opposed to merely the first keeper of the robes to her second. "You have indulged yourself quite enough." "I had no intention of indulging myself," Lavinia tried to explain in a voice as patient as it was deferential. "It is only that I am a little tired and—" "Tired? What a fragile creature you are! One would have thought that women reared from your origins have hardier souls and bodies than this." Lavinia's father was a music tutor and scholar, and her late mother was a harp prodigy. To listen to the court ladies, one might have thought Lavinia spent her childhood tilling hard soil. She did not correct the older woman, however. That, she knew, would lead to nothing but further acrimony. She had to do the sensible thing. She had to swallow the implied insult, pretend she was too foolish to have understood it, and nod. Loud laughter caught her attention. She was acquainted with the men laughing, the royal equerries, from the young ones to the old ones, but she knew none of them well. They were standing apart as a small group, all tall and broad-shouldered, the young men strapping, the senior courtiers having the look of military heroes. All but the man who had just finished speaking, the one whose joke caused such uproarious laughter. He was tall. However, that was the only thing the sandy-haired gentleman had in common with them. He was lithe, rather than thickly muscular, and dressed in the pink of fashion to a slightly greater extent than was acceptable at the strict and sober court of King George and Queen Charlotte. His formal waistcoat of white silk was embroidered a smidgen too elaborately. His shirt, as far as Lavinia could judge from its exquisitely ruffled sleeves, was also of silk instead of linen. Among the other men he seemed to glow, and it was not only the matter of the candlelight reflecting upon his pale fair hair. "God Almighty!" Mrs. Schwellenberg said. "In my day a young man of his kind would have been called a macaroni." "Why?" Lavinia asked, not dragging her gaze away. "Because of the Italian foppishness, of course. Though I suppose these days most fops rather emulate the French." What a peculiar thing the Mrs. Schwellenberg's mind must be, Lavinia mused, as must the mind of most courtiers be. Out in the streets, in the coffee-houses and print shops of London, emulating the French meant alarming things that started with atheism and ended in a royal murder. Here within the walls of St. James's Palace, or Kew, or more usually Windsor, time stood still, and the French ways still meant fashions and elaborate wigs. The fair-haired equerry looked away from his friends and right at her. His eyes were grass-green, and a smile of merriment was still on his lips. These were lips that some, Mrs. Schwellenberg for one, would have called uncommonly full for a man. For a second, Lavinia imagined the devastation this smile and this mouth must have caused among the ladies of the temps before the gentleman took his honoured post among the ladies of the court after he did. "I do hope," the first keeper of the robes remarked, "you are not finding yourself enraptured by Viscount Granville." "Of course not." Lavinia finally looked at her, but she couldn't quite summon enough indignation to infuse her voice with. "I didn't even know his name and title before you told me." "I doubt you have any need to know his Christian name in any case. It is unlikely your paths are going to cross that often. At least I hope they won't, for the sake of your own safety." "Is he a violent man?" "He is worse. He is a man without an earnest bone in his body, as countless ladies who had been the recipients of his gallantry can attest. The ladies in question had their husbands' names to protect them, not to mention their noble blood. You, Miss Dudley, do not." Lavinia recoiled almost physically. The first keeper of the robes was often guilty of petty cruelty, but lying was not among her habits. If what Mrs. Schwellenberg said was true, Lord Granville was one of the most dangerous creatures to young women like her. A pretty-coloured viper, someone apt to drain one's life and dignity away before leaving one as a disgraced husk and merrily moving along to another victim. Lavinia wasn't sure vipers drained their victims. She made a mental note to work on her metaphors. Her new life of service gave her very little time for actual writing, but that didn't mean she could allow her skills to go to waste. It was as though the Viscount heard her thoughts, for as soon as the music had stopped, he stepped away from the group and walked in her direction. He couldn't be genuinely interested in her company, could he? The sandy-haired Viscount stopped when he reached the corner where Lavinia and Mrs. Schwellenberg were standing. At first, Lavinia still entertained some vain hope he wanted to strike up a conversation with the first keeper of the robes, a far more exalted lady than Lavinia herself was, or would ever be. When a smile lit up his face like a touch of sunlight, it was Lavinia he was looking at. "I don't believe I had the honour of being introduced to you. I beg you to forgive me." His voice was light as satin, without a trace of any kind of grave regret. "I have another time to make many acquaintances. Serving His Majesty is not a sinecure." "Neither is serving Her Majesty," Lavinia wanted to reply in the same easy, sparkling tone. His words loosened something in her, if only for a moment. That must have been how those women who followed every dictate of fashion and laced their waists in tightly felt when their stays were loosened. But the first keeper of the robes was breathing over her shoulder, and the ballroom was filled with people with keen ears. So Lavinia couldn't say the truth or even hint at it. Instead, she schooled her face into an expression of formal politeness and replied, "I am sure it's a great honour for your family." "My father would have considered it a great honour indeed had he still been with us." His Majesty is a father to us all, Mrs. Schwellenberg intervened sharply, and he has need of his sons, especially in times of trouble. Lavinia suspected all three of them knew that when she spoke of trouble, it was not the war with France she meant. It was the battle raging inside King George's own head, the battle where there could be no victors. But no one speaks of such things in the middle of a glittering ballroom, guarded and warmed against the winter chill, on an occasion as awash with joy as a royal birthday. No one was supposed to. No doubt, Lord Granville replied flippantly. Would you be so kind as to introduce one of his metaphorical sons to his metaphorical daughter in that case? Miss Dudley, Mrs. Schwellenberg said coldly, let me introduce Hugh, Viscount Granville to you. Your lordship, let me introduce to you Miss Lavinia Dudley, the second keeper of the robes. Miss Dudley? The famed novelist? That she might have been before she accepted Her Majesty's gracious offer. Now, she is the second keeper of the robes. It would be a shame, Lord Granville said, if one of those things really could supersede the other. My cousins were quite enraptured by Miranda. I don't believe I know the lady, the first keeper of the robes replied. Miranda was Miss Dudley's debut novel. My only novel so far, Lavinia ventured, the old fear gripping her again. What if it was really to be her only novel? What if she never finished all those other frantic works she started and left after arriving at court? Or what if she finished them, but they produced nothing but disappointment in the reading public? That would almost be worse. An unwritten work was always a masterpiece, while a thing on paper was more often than not a misshapen clod of words. Modest as well as lovely, Lord Granville observed. If I were a man writing for the papers, I would already be puffing you up on account of these things alone. Your lordship, this is quite forward, Mrs. Schwellenberg said sharply. Is it? I am not commenting on the allure of her gown. Presumably because you weren't raised in the gutter. I do wonder if Miss Dudley would do me the honour of dancing with me. He spoke as though the reproaches had never come, and didn't pierce him the way they did Lavinia. Lavinia knew she must not say yes to this man under any circumstances, but God above, how dearly she wanted to. She knew in her bones this man would enliven even the stately cotillion, even if he would never have a hand anywhere near her waist, as he would have had in the Allemande. But she also knew she was not a woman of an iron willpower, that her reputation was a fragile thing, and above all, people were watching her for a misstep. Forgive me, your lordship, Lavinia mumbled, but I feel unwell tonight and in no mood for dancing. Do you? I'm sorry to hear that. I imagine so would most men tonight. The implication was clear. If she used her transparent excuse, it would mean she would also have to forego dancing altogether for this evening. The smile on Lord Granville's lips remained just as charming. I am just as sorry to be disappointing them, Lavinia said steadfastly, but such are the circumstances. In that case, I would hate to impose my company on you. I wish you to enjoy the occasion. He nodded to her, and as though it were an afterthought, to Juliana Schwellenberg. Then he turned on his heel and disappeared into the crowd, taking the glow of his presence with him. Chapter 2. This was not the first, or he suspected the last time, Hugh Granville found himself in the bedroom of a woman not his wife. It was very rare indeed, however, for him to do so with the lady in question being absent from the room. Indeed, this was the first time it had happened. Hugh looked around Lavinia Dudley's bedroom. It was small and tidy, almost too tidy, unnaturally so. It went beyond the efforts of a diligent maid. It looked like a room no one lived in, or only a passing guest did. Not a woman who, according to his inquiries, had arrived at court 3 years ago. The room was located on the ground floor. The logic was clear. The second keeper of the robes had to be close to the Queen's apartments in the event of some emergency. The windows looked out onto the bare winter garden, an idyll of dead tranquillity. Hugh went through the drawers of the desk impatiently. He knew his methods were crass, but it was clear from their exchange at the ball that the talk among male courtiers was true. Each one felt Miss Dudley was a being of icy prudery with an equally icy disapproval of less than perfect behaviour. Had it been otherwise, he would have tried to strike up a friendship with her and pry the news of her latest writings out of her openly, or tease or cajole or flatter them out if needs be. He knew his cousin Camilla would never leave him alone otherwise, once she had learnt her favourite authoress was now moving within Hugh's orbit. As it were, he was going to resort to less honourable ways to seize the forbidden knowledge. It was not, Hugh told himself, as though he wanted to harm the lady or her work in any way. If good fortune smiled upon him, she would never even know he laid an eye on her latest draft. Good fortune did smile upon him, and soon enough he discovered a thin sheaf of papers with a title written on top. Oswald, an Elf-giver. Interesting. Had she grown tired of the drawing-rooms of the temps and decided to throw herself into the distant past? The names alone sounded distinctly Saxon to him. He might have known one Oswald back in Gloucestershire, in the distant green past, but the heroine's name was certainly not the kind found on these isles any more. Hugh turned the page carefully and started reading. He was right. The story took place in the murky Dark Ages, in some unspecified time, stranded between the conquerors, when monsters roamed the fens. Miss Dudley didn't delve into supernatural horrors, though. The ones she wrote about were very much human-made. Siblings feuding, lovers divided, a villain blackmailing the heroine into marriage, and a weak father who talked up a storm about a man's duty, but when the push came to shove, the father failed to protect the heroine. It was written in a jagged, tormented torrent of words where only a devotee could have recognised the author of Miranda. Nonetheless, Hugh was somewhat intrigued by how Miss Dudley was going to rescue Elf-giver. The last chapter showed she didn't. The heroine ended up dead, her white body broken on the black crags. Hugh had never thought himself to be a person affected by such dark melodrama. There was, however, something unnerving about the contrast between the scream of a story and the neat, wintry room it was concealed in. He set it aside carefully and renewed his search for the unfinished masterpiece he could write home about. Hugh did find a few unfinished works, but not a single masterpiece. They were all variations on the same theme, a setting far enough back in time to be almost mythical, a limp and listless husk of a heroine, an unending torrent of woes and walls all around them. He discovered heroines wrongfully imprisoned, heroines maimed, heroines forced into marriage, heroines betrayed by every single higher power they held faith in. Hugh thought back to the wary, pale face of Miss Dudley. Was all of this a literary exercise? Or was there a cauldron of passion and misery boiling behind the impassive courtly mask of a prudent lady? He found he hoped, perversely, for the latter. Not that he wished her to be miserable. She, unlike some people, had done nothing to him to warrant it. But if she was, he knew just the way to help her. To help her, and to deliver a neat blow to the person who had once slighted him indeed. This was one of the quiet evening concerts His Majesty delighted in, as some added behind closed doors, in his lucid moments. These people usually preferred the doors in question to be closed very tightly. The harpsichord always left Lavinia cold, but one could not say so in response to a great honour that was the invitation. If one thought of it, the concerts were almost an institution. Papers, even the more irreverent ones, usually acknowledged it was certainly an improvement on the pastimes of His Majesty's father, and a better example than the revels of his son. When Lavinia saw who was taking his place in the seat by her side, her blood did not freeze the way it did the night after the ball. Rather, it boiled in irritation. Such a coincidence could only be a mockery by fate, a mockery, or a human design. I hope tonight brings you pleasure, Miss Dudley, Lord Granville said after the brief, cold greeting. There was something particularly outrageous in his grin as he said the last three words, as though he was promising her pleasures that had nothing to do with a harp, or a harpsichord, or any other instrument. A musical instrument, at least. I would say I hope so for you too, your lordship, but I'm afraid my hope is going to be in vain. How right you are, Miss Dudley! He nodded in mock agreement. How right you are! Things here have certainly gone down since Handel's days. I hope their majesties still like epic works, though. After all, otherwise they might not enjoy your tragedies. Lavinia felt as though the world had grown blurry in front of her eyes, distorting, taking upon itself the outlines of a nightmare. She tried her best to pretend ignorance, but her voice trembled treacherously. I know what you have written this summer, Miss Dudley, and this autumn, and likely through Christmas too. Who dared? Who could? She felt betrayed, thrown into the mud, a helpless child once more. I did. The approaches to your room aren't as well guarded as the approaches to the bedroom of an unwed young woman should be. You give little credit to my daring. You! The music rose, gentle, crystal bright. Lavinia had to lower her voice, feeling fit to fall through the floor or strike the man sitting so nonchalantly by her side. You cad! You venomous creature! A cad I may be, but I don't see what's so caddish about appreciation for good novels. It is out of my love for them that I want to help you. Help me what? Make myself a laughing-stock? But even as Lavinia spoke these words, a foolish faint hope stirred in her heart. Perhaps, for all his jeering ways, Lord Granville really was of a mind to help her. He didn't say he disliked her tragedies, after all. Perhaps he had good connections in the world of arts and letters. Perhaps he even knew Mr. Sheridan himself, the proprietor of the Drury Lane Theatre, or— No, Lord Granville replied, to escape the court. Why on earth do you think I might want to do such a thing? Queen Charlotte did me a great honour when she offered me the place. I am not a spy for the crown, Miss Dudley. You don't have to say these rehearsed lines for me. Whatever were your reasons for accepting the offer, it was not a sincere love for the place and not courtly ambition. I've read Miranda, and I've read your tragedies. These are nothing, Lavinia denied hotly. Mere scribulations. They weren't meant for prying eyes, for any eyes, really. Scribulations? What a curious word. Did you invent it yourself? Lord Granville grinned again, this time curiously, without a touch of wildness or malice. On the contrary, this was the kind of smile that seemed to bask one's whole face in a sunlit glow, and make one seem younger and sweeter in nature. And Lord Hugh Granville, if one thought about it, didn't even really need this effect. He was, in truth, not older than Lavinia herself, she realised. Somehow, in thinking of him as a seasoned rake, she had mentally added a good decade to his years. Let's suppose I did. It's a curious word. Can I write it down? People are looking. Let them think I am an ardent admirer of your talent, writing down the pearls of your prudent words, although I am not sure if they were to think you just as prudent if they read Elf-giver and her kin. It wasn't as bad as some of the tragedies produced on the stage these days, but Miranda, it was not. Are you a critic now? When I need to be. Would you like to hear my opinion? The plot was as convoluted as a cat's cradle and as bleak as barren rocks. I was drenched in winter misery when I wrote it. The characters might have as well been from a medieval mystery play, what with their virtues and vices. That was deliberate, Lavinia lied. The prose, Lord Granville said, with the air of a man delivering an executioner's blow, was terrible, tortured like prisoners in the Borgia dungeons. Lavinia sat speechless. This was indeed a nightmare. Years ago, when she had first published Miranda anonymously, before Hester Thrale Piozzi had taken her under her wing and coaxed her out into the light, these were precisely the kind of words Lavinia feared. To be fair, she feared praise almost as much. She feared any form of fame or recognition that could have allowed people to think her some original, high in her instep. But since she was, despite Lord Granville's evident doubts, a human being and not a creature of porcelain, she feared devastation of this kind worst of all. Was it truly that bad? She heard herself asking, in a voice not so much soft as small. Worse, Lord Granville replied, with an expression of almost gravity. Which is why I think you need to escape this place for good. A gifted creature with an airy pen came in, and a living wreck producing literary cries came out. One doesn't need to be a physician to deduce that the place she passed through was probably not the Garden of Eden. Even if I agree, His Majesty's court is to me a soul-crushing place. Lavinia kept her opinion to herself. Someone might overhear, misunderstand her ironic tone, or indeed choose to misunderstand and carry the whisper further. Then her career, if not, in this more civilized age, her life, was surely to be under threat. Even if we agree that you are right, why would you want to help me? Do I provoke your interest? For a second, it seemed Lord Granville was going to disregard all the rules of decorum that a courtly concert had set and outright laugh. Forgive me, Miss Dudley. Truly forgive me, but you are not the sort of woman who usually provokes my interest. At least the sort of interest that you are hinting at. For one thing, you are unmarried. What a shameless creature you are, your lordship. On the contrary, I am a very cautious one. The husbands of the temps are a great deal more indifferent than its fathers. Then why? I already told you. I like good novels and dislike bad tragedies, and this position seems to make you produce less of the former and more of the latter. This cannot stand. Are you going to petition Her Majesty on my behalf? Lavinia asked, weak hope rearing its head once again. I can, but I don't think that would avail me of anything. My standing at court is not exactly exalted. How so? You are His Majesty's equerry. It's a long story. Let us simply say Queen Charlotte has no reasons to feel benevolent towards me. He must have seduced one of her ladies-in-waiting, Lavinia decided. Everyone knew what care Her Majesty took of the virtue of the women who attended her. No, Lord Granville continued, my plan is a great deal simpler, and, to put it plainly, a great deal merrier. We are going to marry you off. I beg your pardon. Think of it, Miss Dudley. If you are to be Mrs. Something or other, you would not be able to fulfil your duties as the second keeper of the robes any more. Her Majesty will have no choice but to allow you to retire to your husband's home. I hope you do realise that, in that case, I would have to live in that home for the rest of my life. A husband is not a new chip hat. No, although there are ladies who take a great more care of the latter than of the former. Do you have a better idea? I do. She might have been more tempted had the man who offered her this plan was in any way trustworthy, or in any way likely to hold her best interests at heart. But a careless nobleman whose favourite pastime was the seduction of married ladies was most decidedly not either. Lavinia secretly thought every man who violated the sanctity of her writing desk deserved to be hit on the head with a vase. We forget about these absurdities and settle down to listen to whatever remains of the concert. Your future is not an absurdity. That is true. I guard it carefully. Forgive me for deeming Her Majesty as a better guardian of it than you. Lavinia knew she should not have been wasting candles this way. It was, after all, an impossible truth that her being free to retire to bed no earlier than midnight, and having to wake up at 6 in the morning, left her little time to sleep, and she might have been wiser using this time to rest. However, if she had little time and less energy to actually write tales of fiction, she could at least carve out a couple of hours to write letters, these remaining her only link with the outside world. Sometimes, especially when replies took too long, Lavinia wondered if her words ever reached the addressees, or if the world beyond St. James and Windsor and Kew had drowned in some deadly fog and quietly expired without her noticing. The last time she actually saw anyone from her old life, the life that now seemed half a dream, was months ago, in high summer, when she was walking to the chapel with the others, and saw Hester Thrale Piozzi standing by the palace gate. The memory of that day flooded in. When Lavinia saw Mrs. Thrale Piozzi standing by the palace gate, she couldn't help but cry out in girlish joy and run to meet the grand dame of the world of letters and her former patroness. My, Mrs. Thrale Piozzi said wryly upon looking Lavinia up and down, you look so very elegant. Nothing at all like that half-made thing I once received in my house. It was a compliment, on the face of it. However, Lavinia couldn't help but sense there was something scratching beneath the smooth surface. I do miss these dinners in your house, Mrs. Thrale Piozzi. Lavinia genuinely missed the dinners and wished there could be more. You have other duties now, I'm sure. I know you'll understand. You are a married woman again now, after all. And a woman has as many weighty duties to her husband as a servant of the crown does to her. If you insist so, Miss Dudley. You would know better. I wouldn't say my Signor Piozzi imposes such heavy duties on me. Oh! Lavinia grasped the offered thread eagerly. How were your travels with him? Did he like them? Did you? Did your daughter? And is it true you're planning to write a book about it? A little compendium of letters, more like, after the fashion of Lady Montague. My real work is my memoirs about Dr. Johnson. Will you send me an early copy to read? Lavinia knew she was crossing all lines with this demand, but it was as if a ravenous maw opened within her and demanded as much as possible while the feeding time still lasted. It's only that I have no time to go into town and no capacity to ask anyone to go for me, and won't be able to find a circulating library or a subscription library or any other kind of library, and Mrs. Thrale Piozzi parted her lips to reply, but Mrs. Schwellenberg, who came up to her on the soft courtly slippers, grasped her sleeve and pulled her to the side, none too gently. Lavinia wondered if Mrs. Thrale Piozzi would have delivered a rebuff or a promise if Mrs. Schwellenberg hadn't interrupted their conversation. Have you lost your wits? The first keeper of the robes hissed, trying to play truant. Is it faith that you spurn, or merely your duty? I am sorry, Lavinia stammered, the newfound exuberance draining away just as quickly as it came. It's only that Mrs. Thrale Piozzi was my good friend. If there ever was a woman formidable enough to open her mouth when confronted by a court lady, it was Hester Thrale Piozzi. She merely raised one eyebrow and asked, Was? Miss Dudley, are you angry at me, or dead and entombed? Have I been speaking with your ghosts, as if it were the battlements of Elsinore? Mrs. Schwellenberg looked her in the eye for the first time, instead of scolding Lavinia over her head. Then she leaned closer and said, As far as you are concerned, she might as well be. She dragged Lavinia away, into the slow procession. Thinking back to that night, Lavinia was less than pleased with her actions, or rather, her lack of action. It occurred to her now, in the dead of night, there might have been different paths Lavinia could have taken. She could have confronted Mrs. Schwellenberg over her outrageous words. She could have torn her hand from her grasp and refused to go. Or she could have willed herself to become light as air and floated up to the moon. It was about just as likely. Unfortunately, that had not been the end of the matter. The crowning conclusion of it was more humiliating than anything that preceded it. When the congregation was taking its place in the royal chapel, Queen Charlotte had turned her head and looked straight at Lavinia. She felt frozen to her core now, just as she did then. Her Majesty's words had been sharp when she asked who the painted foreigner was. Lavinia couldn't remember now what she had invented in response. She only knew it wasn't a dignified refutation of the last descriptor, or anything that hinted at Mrs. Thrale Piozzi's reputation, wit, friendship with Dr. Johnson, the grand man of letters, or anything else that might have made her deserving of respect. While the exact words eluded Lavinia now, said as they were in the deadly blaze of the sun that was the royal attention, but it was probably something to the effect of, Forgive me, it was an old friend from my former life. Lost in these sleepy recollections now, Lavinia did not at first realise the commotion she was hearing in the corridors was not a thing of dreams. She pressed her head against the door, as though eavesdropping on the outside world. The twin pair of steps grew closer, and then started to recede. Whoever it was, they were walking past her door to some errand of their own. The wise and prudent thing, Lavinia knew, was to step aside and leave whoever it was to their business. For all she knew, it could be a pair of illicit lovers. For all she knew, it could be Lord Granville with his paramour of the month, his arm draped around her waist, his hand probably hanging loose, and his fingers touching the lady's behind or stroking her waist with languorous movements. If so, the woman's face was most likely flushed bright with pleasure and the anticipation of more of it. That could account for the hurry in the footsteps. Lavinia opened the door and stepped out into the corridor. If he or any other rake wanted to carry his liaison out, it was not going to happen outside her door. Caustic remarks that could have belonged on a page were already forming in her thoughts. And then she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. These were not lovers. The pair were two ladies in waiting, one almost Lavinia's age, one significantly older, and writ on their faces was pure panic. "What happened?" Lavinia asked breathlessly. The older one didn't even dignify her with a turn of the head. The younger one paused in her frenetic walking. No woman of breeding, and no woman who served as a lady in waiting, would ever do something as uncouth as break into a run, and said breathlessly, "Her Majesty screamed." Blood drained from Lavinia's face. All the horrific tales of French émigrés she ever heard before coming to court flared up in her memory and populated her mind with thoughts of assassinations and revolutionaries. She didn't pause to put on her shoes or think. She hurried down the corridor. It took them a long time to reach the royal bedchamber. It took so long that Lavinia wondered, briefly, fearfully, just how loud the scream must have been for it to reach the woman she was now following, and what could have caused it. When the door to the sacred space finally opened, Lavinia saw a strange chiaroscuro picture, a darkened opulence, several candles burning by the bed, a pale woman upon it, and an old man leaning over her. Lavinia didn't think this time either. She simply grabbed one of the candelabras standing by the bed and raised it high. The younger lady in waiting squealed and caught her hand before Lavinia could bring the heavy object down on the villain's head. Astonished by this betrayal, Lavinia turned to her, ready for a struggle, when the older lady cried out, "Your Majesty, we are terribly sorry. We thought your wife is unwell." "Your wife?" Lavinia stared at the man crouching by the royal bed. He seemed to have very little in common with the father of the nation, the rose-cheeked farmer king, whom every loyal subject born within the last few decades was taught, not always successfully, to love. But the more she looked, the more she recognised the features she glimpsed during the few, within the last few years, very few indeed, public royal appearances. She had just almost hit the King George on the head with a candelabra. Perhaps Mrs. Swellenberg had a point when she thought Lavinia didn't belong at court. "So you know of her illness too?" King George asked, not letting go of his silent wife's hand. There was no way to tell a man with a crown, however afflicted his mind, that you had no idea what he was talking about. Therefore the trio remained silent, blinking politely. "My dear Charlotte has a cold." There was impatience in his voice, but no anger. "Where on earth are her physicians? Some of them are such untrustworthy men. You cannot expect them to care about their patient a whit. Don't you agree, Amelia?" The last words were addressed, shockingly, to Lavinia. He was taking her for Princess Amelia, his beloved little daughter. His daughter might have been as beautiful and sweet-natured as a princess ought to be, but she was not yet 10 years old, much younger than Lavinia. What was Lavinia to do? What could anyone, much less a person with a crumb of compassion in them, do but play along? "I do," she said, avoiding calling him father. It might have helped to placate him. But who knew what rumour the very much sane ladies in the room might make of it in the future? "They are slippery as eels."
What a good girl you are, Amelia, and how you've grown. You will be a good companion to your mother. Your future husband will be a happy man."
A kind of tenderness touched King George's expression. "I doubt she is going to marry," Queen Charlotte ventured, clearly adept in the art of sustaining illusions. "I need Amelia here just as I need her sisters. I hope you don't want me to remain lonely as they marry away."
"Of course not, dear Charlotte. Besides, marriages of blood are so seldom as happy as ours. Do you remember what happened to poor Mathilde when father sent her away?"
It was as though Queen Charlotte's body turned to stone. Her features went set, her arms rigid, and her voice strict as that of a schoolmistress as she said, "We do not talk about that woman in the presence of our daughters, illness or no illness." "Your Majesty," the older lady-in-waiting ventured, "how did you hear of Her Majesty's indisposition?"
"Why, I didn't need to hear of it. I always know when my wife is unwell. She knows all about my complaints, too, or else she wouldn't have surrounded me with so many doctors."
His smile was one of true tenderness, but his eyes glinted just as strangely.
"Luckily, I know how to escape their attentions when they become unbearable. We all need our little tricks, don't we, Charlotte?"
At the mention of regular escapes, the Queen's face grew paler than before. She barely resembled the lady who once publicly scolded Lavinia in the chapel, the lady of splendid, voluminous robes, perfect poise, and glittering attendants. The woman lying in front of her now was white-faced, shadow-eyed, and despite the presence in the room of 3 people besides her husband, incredibly, utterly alone. The younger lady-in-waiting made use of everyone's attention being directed away from her and started sidestepping quietly towards the door.
She didn't get very far.
King George turned sharply, facing her, and this time anger was writ darkly upon his features.
"What sort of an attendant are you, young lady, if you want to abandon your queen in an hour of need? Is it for this that your parents sent you to court? Great honours come with responsibilities."
I know, Your Majesty," the young woman stammered.
"Then don't forget it. Come here. Sit. You are a lady-in-waiting, aren't you?"
"Yes, Your Majesty."
"So wait. Your queen might have a need of you before the dawn comes."
"I assure you, you don't need to worry," the perfectly healthy Queen Charlotte intervened. I feel much better."
"It's better, to be sure. Fevers are a horrid thing. Amelia, come closer. Your mother needs your company and good cheer."
My mother is dead, Lavinia thought, as she knelt by the royal bed. Her knees soon started to hurt, even despite the costly rug that separated her from the hard floors. Through her closed eyelids, she could see the flares that were the lonely candles, amber in the darkness. The night beyond the windows was at full height, and Lavinia knew it was going to be long, long hours before the moon was going to begin its descent and cede its place to the sun. Chapter 3. Lavinia was walking through the garden paths with frenetic, nervous energy, born of a mixture of urgency and fear. What if she miscalculated? What if the royal equerries did not rise so early, or did not take walks here? Or if they did rise early to take walks, what if the man she was seeking did not? What if Mrs. Schwellenberg was to look for her and find her dutiful little room empty? What if— She let out a breath when she saw the group of strapping young men walking among the spring greenery. They were a picture of masculine good cheer, talking about something animatedly between themselves. They could as well have walked out of another world, so far was their mood from Lavinia's dark turmoil. In other circumstances, she would have felt too fearful to approach them. After all, she had only been actually introduced to one of them, and even so she could not simply intrude and drag him away from his fellows. But here and now, her thoughts and decisions were ruled by a different rationale. In some cases, she reasoned, good manners could perhaps be sacrificed to expediency. If the situation was dire enough, of course. As far as she was concerned, the situation was dire enough. "Your Lordship," she addressed Lord Granville, who was at the forefront of the group, "would you mind if we speak?"
Lavinia Dudley agreeing to talk to someone like me without a chaperone? Hell must have frozen over.
It's rather urgent, she pleaded. We are not going to walk far. Your friends would see us all the time. No one would suspect an intrigue or—
Miss Dudley, I was only teasing you. Hugh Granville's green gaze softened a little. Teasing you, in fact, seems a delicious pastime of late. Of course we can walk.
Lavinia gave him a grateful smile. As she took his offered arm, she tried her best to ignore the surprised and interested glances of the male courtiers. The glances were understandable. If this did not smell of intrigue, it smelled of flirtation. They also felt like a white-hot iron to the back of her head. "Is your offer still in force?" she whispered when they took only a few steps away.
My offer to marry you, he said. To someone else, that is, he added with a twinkle in his eye.
Your offer to help me escape.
Well, the trip to Cheltenham hasn't come and gone, has it? That means we still have plenty of time. But, he raised a finger, preempting her reply, I would first like to know what caused such a change of opinion.
Perhaps I came to my senses and realised what a splendid source of guidance you are.
You would have to try better than that if you want to convince me, Miss Dudley.
What do you care? She all but snapped, and flushed when she realised her slip. Lord Granville looked at her with new eyes, but thankfully the look in them was surprised, not offended.
Miss Dudley,
he softened his voice below any register demanded by secrecy.
What exactly has happened?
Nothing. His Majesty— It was easy for pamphlet writers and Grub Street hacks, living as they did far from here, to gleefully write,
His Majesty is stark raving mad.
Lavinia, who existed now close to the unbearably shining centre of power, couldn't even force herself to utter the words, made a mistake. His Majesty thought Her Majesty was sick. He came to her in the night, and I happened to be there, and—
Ah, so the old Farmer George is raving again.
Your lordship!
Your reprimands would have sounded less feeble if you weren't as white as a sheet.
I was only a little shaken.
So little shaken that you even neglected your duties today to run and find me.
I didn't neglect anything. I have no duties today. Her Majesty has decided it might be better— she didn't say safer— to humour His Majesty's fantasy and stayed in bed for the day. My services of dressing her are not required.
I see. He said those two words with something that almost approached sincerity. He raised his left hand, and for a second Lavinia thought he was going to squeeze her fingers in an attempt to soothe her. She froze at the thought of all those men watching them, men who had ears and mouths and wagging tongues no less than women did, whatever some claimed. Fortunately, Lord Granville evidently thought better of it, and he allowed his hand to drop back. Lavinia was relieved, of course, that he didn't give fodder to rumours, but deep down she must have been distraught indeed. She was just a little disappointed she had not experienced the touch of his gloved hand against hers. He did, she noticed, have rather elegant fingers. Is there anyone in particular you thought I could ask to take me away? Her gaze slid involuntarily over to the group of his friends. Not as you are now. Whatever do you mean? The sorts of men you are looking at. The sorts of men who can insist upon marriage and risk Her Majesty's displeasure need dowries, not manuscripts. It's not that they never marry ravishing beauties with only a few pounds a year to their name, but I am not a ravishing beauty, Lavinia finished for him. This sort of frankness had drained out of her like blood in the hands of a medieval physician soon after she had arrived at court. But something in Lord Granville's manner made confessions easy. That fact made her wonder if her portraits of the villainous seducer in Miranda was all wrong. Perhaps most of such men weren't sleek, dark, and dangerous. Perhaps they rather had a gift to elicit laughter and anger alike from their would-be conquests at the drop of a hat, and they later turned to those more heated sensations. Perhaps not, but you can be made to resemble one very well. How? With a bit of money and the right clothes. I can provide the former, and I'm sure you know a mantua maker who will supply the latter. If anyone asks, you want to be well turned out for the royal visit. What are people going to think if they see you paying my bills? My dear Miss Dudley, do you really think I haven't yet learnt to pay a woman's bills in a way that doesn't allow anyone to see it? Why are you doing this for me? Lavinia asked bluntly, unnerved.
She was not a fool enough to think that unprompted and honest generosity, especially as flowing from young men to young women they were not married to, existed in this world. I've told you that already. Yes, you like good novels and hate bad tragedies. Ah, so you remembered my words verbatim. I am flattered. You don't have to be, Lord Granville, for I didn't believe them. That is, I readily believe you like good novels, but I don't think it's enough of a reason for you to try to circumvent the royal will. What have I told you, Miss Dudley? That circumventing the royal will is the whole purpose. Lavinia frowned. Surely he was joking. There was no way a young equerry would want to deceive Queen Charlotte deliberately unless for some great gain. Unless... Are you doing this for a lark? For a second his lips pressed together in a way that perplexingly spoke of frustration, even anger. Then the skies cleared and Lord Hugh Granville became his sunlit self again. Yes, Miss Dudley, for a lark. Are you going to assist me in this lark? Lavinia reflected on her choices and realised she had very few of them. Yes, your lordship, she said. I will. God almighty, the mantua maker said upon entering Lavinia's room. One would have thought that with all the gilt and finery they have in this place and all the space and light, they would have found you a better place to sleep in than this. I am perfectly satisfied with my accommodation, Mrs. Hunt, Lavinia said dutifully, the words like well-worn smooth pebbles in her mouth. Her inner voice murmured to her that she would run no risk by complaining about it to a complete outsider, a woman who had no connection to court, and thus was unlikely to wag her tongue about it with anyone who mattered here. But the key to self-restraint was an iron habit, and to break it even once would have meant making the whole construction crash down one day. If you say so, my dear. I can imagine your room at home was somewhat bigger, though. Mrs. Hunt, who used to dress Lavinia's late mother before she began dressing Lavinia, had never precisely seen the inside of the Dudleys' household. They were not of such rank as to be visited by a mantua maker in the comfort of their home. Her guess, however, was quite correct. Lavinia replied with a non-committal noise, of the sort that could be interpreted equally as an assent, a negation, and an expression of indifference to the whole matter. I suppose your new position has consolations, Mrs. Hunt continued. All those young bucks at court. It is for them that you are now looking to dress yourself up a little, isn't it? Mrs. Hunt, Lavinia blushed, I have no such intention. It is only that I have realised I hadn't anything new in my wardrobe, and you don't need to fib to me, Miss Dudley. Nothing sinful about wanting to get married well. That is why you've come to court, haven't you? Lavinia was startled. Was that what they were saying about her? That her reason for accepting the Queen's offer was not to honour her family, advance her father's career and her own, but to claw her way up into the temps? She couldn't well deny that charge all that vehemently, though. Not now. Not any more. Instead, she decided to respond with a secretive smile. I knew you were a sensible girl, Mrs. Hunt nodded. Do you have any ideas of what you want? I think a half-dress, maybe, of... Lavinia paused, then forced herself to recall money was no objection for a while. Of satin, grey. Satin? But it's long since past time you had a proper spring suit. Only a demi-saison silk will do for one of those. That's... Lavinia's first urge was to say, too expensive. Reasonable. Grey's not your colour, either. Well, it is if you want to impress the gentleman with your becoming modesty, but in my experience they are only impressed by it on the pages of conduct books. They might seek this quality in a wife, but to entice them down the aisle, it would not do. I do hope you aren't saying I was don something crimson, Lavinia teased her old acquaintance. Of course not. Crimson is not your colour. Pale blue would do much better. Sleeves, white, crepe edged with blonde. I think the Burton colours would all fit you well. The Burton colours? The hues that she used to dress the poor late French queen in. Powder blue, soft yellow, some green. The fabrics might be too daring for these shores. I've heard Her Majesty has strict views on female attire, but the colours would do very well. The poor late French queen. Lavinia had heard these words very often the last... How long was it? 6 months? 7? People spoke somberly of the death of monarchs and the end of a great era of French predominance, but there was also a suppressed relief in their words. Thank God it did not happen here. Thank God our Queen Charlotte is alive and well. And deep down, people were grateful Queen Charlotte was a paragon of virtue. No Grub Street hack would dare to imply she was having an affair, and no demagogue would find words to turn mobs against her. The people were thankful Her Majesty was a pillar of propriety, the shining star of all becoming womanly qualities. "There is an idea I had for a while," Mrs. Hunt continued, "but I wasn't sure what to do with it. Most women I dress, to be frank, do not have the means for something of the kind. And you, I thought, would not have the desire, but now that has changed." She did not search for the drawing all that long, Lavinia noticed. That meant she didn't have it buried as deep as she implied. If anything, she must have prepared it before she came here. After all, who would have both the money and the wish for whatever magnificent creation Mrs. Hunt's imagination produced, if not the prodigy of the Dudleys, who was doubtless thriving at court? Lavinia looked at the drawing in question, and the vision filled her with sudden yearning. The creation to be was a dress of pale green silk with a Tiffany petticoat, festooned with lilacs. On her head, the faintly sketched figure wore a headdress of white feathers. "The headdress is not for every day, of course," Mrs. Hunt clarified, as if that needed clarification. "Only for the Queen's drawing-room days, perhaps." Yes, Lavinia reflected, it would do for the drawing-rooms very well, just as the gown itself would do very well for less formal evening occasions. If I can afford it. The thought entered her head, unbidden, propelled by the sheer force of habit. She could afford it now, technically, but a lifetime of thrift could not be overcome by a single promise to pay for one extravagance. Perhaps not just one. If Lord Granville really was serious about what he called his lark, a paradox in words in itself, perhaps something that she would do well to remember for a future piece of writing, he might pay for all the extravagances the occasion demanded. Most likely he was as generous, if not more so, with the ladies he graced with his attentions in a different way. The thought filled her with distaste, no doubt stemming from her lack of acquaintance with that side of ton life. Lavinia swallowed, trying to banish the bile that rose to her throat for a second. The humorous imaginings of showering Lord Granville's desk with unpaid bills disappeared from her mind. "I am sorry," Lavinia said. I don't think I could wear something of this kind." "Why ever not?" It's too short." She found a flaw to focus on. "See, it almost bears my ankles." "Oh, dear child, but you have such pretty ankles. If you were to find graceful enough slippers, you would look an angel." "Well, not an angel. Men, be they nobility or petty traders or paupers for that matter, would take a woman of flesh and blood over a floating angel any time." "When you say take, do you mean to wife, of course?" Mrs. Hunt replied, a picture of innocence. "What else? Unless the floating angel has a large dowry." "You have always been a very pragmatic woman." "I have, yes. I'm proud of the fact. Your mother was no dreaming seraph either. I've known her. If she were still alive, perhaps you wouldn't have bricked yourself up in that high tower of sermon ideas. Too short, indeed. You are trying to catch a husband, dear Lavinia, not impress some Spanish monk." To catch a husband. Her aim could easily be distilled in those 4 words. Yes, Lavinia Dudley, the woman who had prided herself on living the life of the mind and daughterly duty, was indeed out to catch a husband so that she could evade that duty. And in order to do so, she was accepting financial gifts from a rakish gentleman whose aims were known only to himself. Sermon ideas, indeed. Perhaps all that she was looking for was permission to rebel, and the night of terror in the company of a mad king and a frightened queen gave her exactly that. The rebellion would be short-lived, Lavinia promised herself. It was not likely to last the year. Or, should she be so fortunate, a month. "Perhaps you are right," she said, lowering her gaze in what felt like a parody of her usual withdrawing ways. Perhaps I do need this gown with a Tiffany petticoat. It was 7 in the morning, and Lavinia, who had to rise at 6, was not in a mood for surprises. Nonetheless, surprise was what she felt when she hurried down the corridor leading from her room in the Queen's apartments and almost ran into Mrs. Schwellenberg. "Good morning," Lavinia said, pressing down the sense of unease rising in her heart. She knew the first keeper of the robes never rose so early in the morning. The process of dressing Queen Charlotte's hair and person was begun by the soft-spoken German Mrs. Thielke and finished by Lavinia herself. Mrs. Thielke dealt with her coiffure, and Lavinia assisted with her clothing, passing the hoop and gown, slippers, neck-handkerchief, and finally the fan to Mrs. Thielke, who passed each item to Her Majesty. Mrs. Schwellenberg came in nowhere in this process. She was, if anything, something more of an honourable companion than a quiet servant of the kind Lavinia herself now was. "I do wish I could have said the same, Miss Dudley," the first keeper of the robes replied, her iron-grey eyes implacable. "I have been seeking you many an afternoon, but it seems you are very busy. With a mantua-maker of all people." "I apologize." Lavinia could not keep a certain irritated haste out of her voice. She had a duty to perform, and she could not imagine the consequences if she were late for the dressing ceremony, or rather for the ceremony of passing clothing items to Mrs. Thielke so that she could perform the dressing proper. "Do you think me simple, Miss Dudley?" "I beg your pardon?" "You have affected the modesty of a church mouse all these years you have been my charge here." Lavinia winced internally at the wording. Her charge, indeed, as though she were a perpetual schoolgirl, and Mrs. Schwellenberg her governess, who was never to be sent away. "Yet now," the older woman continued, "you are suddenly decking yourself out in finery. I have happened to overhear some of your conversations with that Mrs. Hunt. Silk? Satin? One might have thought you were deeming yourself a noble heiress." "I had no idea," Lavinia thought archly, "that the medieval sumptuary laws were still enforced in our country, and only noble heiresses could legally wear certain good fabrics." She shut the thought down almost before it fully formed. Rationally, she knew no one at court could read her mind. Irrationally, she had taught herself to be careful, just in case. After all, a person unguarded in their thoughts was likely to be unguarded in their words one day too. "I assure you, Mrs. Schwellenberg, I had no such notions." "I have always thought you a woman with unseemly desires. Desires to rise above your station, of course. Else you would not have had the brazen cheek to accept this post when Her Majesty offered it out of graciousness." "Do you think it would have been any less brazen of me to deny the honour Her Majesty decided to give me?" "In that case, yes," Mrs. Schwellenberg said bluntly. "But your behaviour does not stop there, does it? Do you think I do not know where pretty young women with no lineage suddenly get the money to spend on silk and satin, where previously a lawn hood was out of the realm of possibility?" "Mrs. Schwellenberg, I have no idea," Lavinia lied. She had every idea, in fact, and wanted the ground to swallow her whole. "They find themselves protectors," Mrs. Schwellenberg replied with utter disdain. "Obliging gentlemen who pay their bills in return for discreet favours in dark corners." "I assure you it's not true in my case." 3 years ago, before she came to court, even 2 years ago, before it grew into her bones, Lavinia would have erupted in response to such an insinuation. Now, like a giddy chit tamed into a good wife, she knew better. "Her Majesty is going to hear of it, if it is true indeed," the first keeper of the robes threatened. "And then, Miss Dudley, you are going to rue the day you decided to ape your betters and insert yourself into their ranks." "You should not worry, Mrs. Schwellenberg," Lavinia replied, with becoming meekness, allowing herself to finish the phrase in her mind. "For Her Majesty is not going to hear about the source of this largesse. The money comes from the success of my father's latest work. The 3rd tome of his History of German Music is now on sale in Mr. Wickman's printing shop. I had no idea music is such a profitable business in this country, though I suppose I should have guessed as much. Were it not, music teachers would have never been able to see their daughters serve at court." With this parting shot, the first keeper of the robes stepped aside and allowed Lavinia to pass. The courtyard of Windsor Castle, usually orderly, was in pandemonium today on the eve of the court's departure to Cheltenham. The air was sharp with the tang of horses, which was unnaturally sweetened with hundreds of competing perfumes. Those who recalled the original visit to Cheltenham in '88 claimed the departure was an even more chaotic affair back then. It was, after all, before the new fashions from the continent did away with panniers and powdered wigs, and fitting all that into a carriage was pure Herculean labour. Lavinia herself wore her hair natural, albeit more out of convenience than modishness. So did plenty of younger court ladies for one reason or another. Few were bold enough to wear the French-style flowing gowns that left so little to the imagination in the presence of Queen Charlotte and her virtuous companions of Mrs. Schwellenberg's ilk. Lavinia regretted that. Had they indeed worn those dresses with their simple Grecian outlines, the business of arranging everyone in the vehicles would have gone much easier. "We can put some of the trunks inside my carriage," Mrs. Schwellenberg insisted to one of the footmen. "But then you would barely have any room for your own person, not to mention your companions." "Miss Dudley would manage, I imagine. So will I, if needs must." Lavinia gulped, as she imagined exactly how she was going to manage in a cramped space over the many hours of the journey in proximity to the woman who loathed her and anything that could give her comfort. The order of the words in Mrs. Schwellenberg's statement was not lost on her. Words were, after all, her tools of trade. She turned away, ardently looking for any vehicle that seemed to be at least half full, even if it didn't belong to anyone she knew. She knew how horrible it would be of her to impose so on anyone else, but it was less horrible than the notion of a whole day in a closet's worth of space with the first keeper of the robes. When she saw Lord Granville on the step to his carriage, emblazoned with a bright crest, she almost cried out for joy. She bit her lip, of course, forcing the display of emotion down. However, something must have reflected in her stare, for when their eyes met, Lord Granville paused. He stepped down and strode over to her. It was no easy task, for, despite the courtyard being filled with great ladies and the pinks of fashion, they jostled no less than a crowded fish market, and were affronted a great deal easier. He did not barge through them as much as he glided, a charming smile there, a quick mollifying apology there, and the glittering throng parted for him as though he were a prophet, and they the waters of the Red Sea. "Miss Dudley," Lord Granville said, "what a pleasant surprise! How may I be of service?" His question, usually a mere tribute to politesse, sounded urgent. God Almighty, I must look terrified. Lavinia attempted to compose herself more fully. "There is a trouble with Mrs. Schwellenberg's luggage. We might not fit into the carriage, or—" "Or you might, but it's going to be an utterly hellish situation if you do," he said. "Good thing my own carriage is gaping with emptiness. I would be honoured if you share the journey with me." Everything in Lavinia, every nerve in her body screamed out to say yes. This yearning had nothing to do with his lordship's easy charm, quick wit, or the way the spring sun turned his fair hair into gold. She was too sensible for such notions. No, she had a much better reason, namely the refuge he was going to give her. But then, he had no sister, no living mother, no female relative travelling with him. What if someone thought they did something untoward during the long journey to Cheltenham? It was this lingering doubt, this fatal delay, that cost Lavinia the hours of tete-a-tete with Lord Hugh Granville. For while she was prevaricating, Mrs. Schwellenberg, whose hearing had always been as sharp as her manners were proper, had time to react. "Absolutely not," she replied flatly. "Forgive me, your lordship, I am casting no aspersions on your reputation, but people might imagine all kinds of things at their dish of scandal broth." She said it without much effort. To disguise the fact, she very much was trying to cast aspersions on his reputation. "Perhaps, then, you yourself could take her place in my carriage. Even if it is the den of iniquity on wheels, as you suppose, such a well-reputed matron as you would never cause rumours." For a second only, Lavinia envied Lord Granville the ease and mockery with which he spoke his opinion. For a second only, she yearned for it, as a crippled child might yearn for the flight of a bird. That yearning lasted only a second. "Where, then, will Miss Dudley go?" "I would have thought that obvious. Miss Dudley would travel in your carriage. There should be enough room for one, especially if the one in question is such a slight young woman." "Miss Dudley?" In my carriage? Mrs. Schwellenberg asked acidly. Why, your lordship, I am surprised you haven't proposed I give my gloves up to her too, and my post in the bargain. Come, Miss Schwellenberg, everyone knows you for a woman of Spartan stoicism, but would you truly prefer discomfort when offered is opposite? The first keeper of the robes looked at him, and then at Lavinia. Turning her head slightly, she looked at the trunks being loaded, even now, into her carriage. We accept your gracious offer, Lord Granville, but on one condition only. Miss Dudley's virtue is in my charge, and I am going to travel with you, to ensure nothing threatens it. Would you? I thought you said the only threat to her virtue are the gossips who are going to discuss this arrangement over their dishes of tea, not anything that I myself can do. His sunny face was innocence itself. But of course, far be it for me to disappoint a lady. He left it hanging in the air, never clarifying which of the two women, the older or the younger, the venerable or the interloper, did he just dignify with the title of a lady.